Hello, this is Ryan Beasy, and you're listening or watching the Westminster Standard Podcast. In a moment, we will dive into episode 35 of season 2 with our Modfather and several others on an all-star panel to discuss the overtures this year relating to the government of the PCA largely. But before we do, I want to talk about an amazing opportunity that Metanoia Prison Ministries is offering on the Tuesday of General Assembly, Tuesday, June 24th, from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. They are able to offer a tour of Walker State Prison and the mentoring program that goes on there from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. on Tuesday, June 24th. If you are interested in learning more about what Metanoia is up to and the effects of this remarkable program, I know a number of you listened to our episode with Lowell Ivy, Barry Smith, and Bill Henshaw talking about the amazing work of God at Walker State Prison. Well, the Tuesday of General Assembly, you have the opportunity to tour that facility. And so if you are interested and have the time, if you're not on a committee of commissioner, you can sign up by emailing Shelby Howell, sghowell at pcanet.org. And she will get you signed up for that, as well as get any additional information. So please, if you're going to be in Chattanooga on Tuesday and are looking for something to do Tuesday morning, you don't have a committee of commissioners to attend, please consider joining the tour with Metanoia Ministries at Walker State Prison. Well, now, episode 35 of the Westminster Standard Podcast. This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. It is General Assembly season. Welcome to this second of what could be 50 shows dedicated to the overtures for this year's 52nd Presbyterian Church in America General Assembly. We are joined by the Modfather himself, Teaching Elder Fred Greco. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And Teaching Elder Stephen Warhurst. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
You may be the only man in the history of the PCA to have had a protest filed against your address. So you're quite GA famous, as they say. And then another Steve Tipton. Welcome.
Thanks, Ryan. Good to be on.
Last year you were the Overtures chairman, if I remember correctly.
That's what I'm told.
And then the chairman of our Committee on Constitutional Business, Ruling Elder Matt Fender. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. I have been known to describe Teaching Elder Steve Warhurst as a PCA folk hero. The incident you were alluding to.
Yes, without a doubt. Well, this has been a big news spring for the PCA, both infamous and famous. There's been a lot of trouble at Mission North America. In my short time in the Presbyterian Church in America, I don't remember an agency or permanent committee having this much trouble. There was the advice to illegal aliens, which I was corrected. It was not legal advice, but was just advice about the law. And then there was the affinity groups, talk about a deficit, which I hear has been completely filled, and then a loss of a finance director. Not a lot of details in the commissioner handbook, but those of you who have been in the PCA longer than I have, do you remember this much controversy about a single agency in recent memory?
Can't say that I do. No.
Well, hopefully we'll get some clarity from the floor, and then there's some controversy about the administrative committee. We'll talk about one of those very important overtures, but there's one overture from Northwest Georgia Presbytery, or is it PD Presbytery, that will turn the magazine of the Presbyterian General Assembly to simply a news outlet, which may save us all some controversy. But despite these controversies, we've got a lot of good news, slow, steady growth. Something to be thankful for. The more I talk to people at Twin Lakes or Presbytery, the more I hear that the Lord is just gathering people into the churches. Are you seeing that where you all are serving?
Yes,
Yeah.
You?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
we are. Yes.
No, I mean, without a doubt, I see new visitors every week. Families, people of all ages, really, that are just showing up. Some previously unchurched, some fleeing churches that have apostatized. Sort of the full range. But I think in the current sort of secular cultural moment that we are in, we're seeing people who are suddenly starting to look around and search for meaning, realizing that the messages that are being fed by the dominant culture just leave them empty.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm seeing slow, steady growth. And if I can use your podcast as a platform, one of the problems we have in the PCA is that full half of our churches do not report their statistics. And so we don't really know how large the PCA is, but we know it's larger than the statistics we have. That would mean that we would assume that the growth has been larger than what we have. And the giving is larger than what we know we have. The Sunday school attendance, et cetera. So I want to encourage all churches, even small churches, to just submit the most basic of statistics for the encouragement of our lay people so that they can see, that the Lord is doing a work slow and steady in the PCA.
Yes, and it's one of the things I appreciate about the Stated Clerk's report is that I think every year I've been a part of the PCA, except for one, there's been growth and in giving, in total members, in baptism. I was talking with Danny Ruth, who's a pastor in Central Mississippi, just brand new church plant, about 65, 70 people attending, 7 adult baptisms, and conversion. That's just wonderful. Well, so the Commissioner Handbook dropped a week or two ago, and the SJC report was in there. I promised there'll be a supplement to that. But Mr. Chairman of the SJC, are there any decisions you want to talk about or tell people to look at of note?
Well, first, forgive all the typos because I'm currently the secretary, so I prepared that report. I've been elected the incoming chairman when we come to assembly. I would just encourage people to look through them. Most of what people think the SJC does is decide gigantic, controversial theological opinions. That's not what we do. It's almost all about process, but often the process is very important, as well. One decision that's probably worth looking at is, for the first time in the history of the SJC, we had a 12-12 vote. Yeah. A case out of Chicago Metro. And we had to have a discussion about what that meant. And what we decided, in line with parliamentary procedure and sort of general common sense, is that when you have a tie vote, that means that you can't advance a motion. So what that meant is we did not disturb the presbytery's decision. But this was an interesting case regarding charges against a teaching elder by a staff member, and I think it's worth looking at. But trying to discover exactly how our rules of discipline work, I think would be very helpful for all elders.
Yeah, save themselves a lot of pain, as you were discussing at Tennessee Valley Presbytery a few days ago, that if you follow the book, you can save yourself a couple of years of litigation.
Yes.
Well, if I could say, Ryan, I doubt, unfortunately, many presbyters that the SJC report is their bedtime reading. But I do think, in terms of watching, in a way, like watching other people go through a process. I'm a younger brother. I learned to not do a lot of things by watching my older brother make mistakes. I made my own mistakes, but I wasn't going to make his mistakes. And I do think it's helpful sometimes to read through them. I'd love it if there was like a digest at some point, because I would say about 75% of that report is not terribly instructive, but the 25% that is often worth wading through the rest of it. So, but it's important.
This is probably worth mentioning, Ryan, that the Stated Clerk's Office, in conjunction with Greenville Seminary, is preparing a searchable database website of all historic SJC decisions. So that, for example, if you had a question about BCO 38-1 and a case without process, you could go to this website and find all of the relevant cases that have been decided on that provision. Now, our book provides that we don't have the same kind of stare decisis precedent that United States courts do. But it is helpful to know, as Steve said, where the errors have been made so that you don't make them again. I don't know exactly when this is going live, but I know they're making good progress, and I think it's going to be of great benefit to the church.
That is super exciting.
Undoubtedly. I did note the Metro New York matter that the General Assembly referred to its Judicial Commission has been resolved. So there may be some back and forth with RPR still to play. So we don't want to talk too much because that may still go back to SJC. But I assume, Mr. Fender, you'll keep us apprised of what RPR is up to. Are you on there too, Steve Tipton?
For the rest of my life, I think.
You know,
Natural or otherwise.
Our presbytery just elected a new RPR rep, Jonathan Brooks, a wonderful brother with a great podcast. If you haven't found it, I highly recommend it. But the argument that I made to our nominating committee chairman to have Jonathan go was, well, people have been frustrated with what the committee he chairs, Review of Session Records, is doing. And I said, well, this would be a fitting punishment for Jonathan to have to serve on RPR. Well, another important aspect of the General Assembly, one that's often overlooked, is the nominating committee report. Just one of you want to give us an overview of how people get onto the permanent committees and what they do?
I can, Ryan, if you'd like. So
please.
We have to populate various permanent committees for our related to all our committees and agencies. So basically boards, so to speak. MTW, MNA, RUF, Administrative Committee, and then also agencies like Covenant College, Covenant Seminary, the PCA Foundation, etc. And the way that we populate those committees is by electing ruling elders and teaching elders in equal proportions. And in some instances, I'm not exactly sure if it's retirement. Well, if it was Geneva and Foundation, you can have deacons as well. And then, of course, some of these committees, you can have NAPARC members as well. I think Covenant College is one of those. Anyway, they're elected to 3 or 4 year terms. And additionally, the Standing Judicial Commission, which is not a committee or a board, but a commission of the Assembly of 24 elders, 12 ruling, 12 teaching, they're elected in staggered terms as well. This would kind of remind you, it's kind of like the Senate. So unlike the House, where everyone is elected every 2 years, in the Senate, you have 6 year terms and elections every 2 years. So basically a third of the Senate is turning over every election. It's similar in the boards and agencies. And because the work of the church, shock, goes on more than just 1 week of the year at the General Assembly. It has to go on all year long. We're planting churches, we're sending missionaries, we're doing college ministry, we're running a camp, etc. We need trusted men and brothers to do that mission. And the way that the General Assembly keeps oversight of this in the main is by electing men to these positions. And so presbyteries will nominate men to these positions. And the nominating committee is made up of one representative from every presbytery, which is, I think, 88 now as we speak. And it meets in Atlanta a few weeks before Easter. And it sifts through all of the potential nominees and votes to choose certain men to go forward as a nominating committee nominee. And those men are nominated for those terms, for those positions. But of course, those decisions aren't just made by 88 men in a room. So any man can be nominated for any position by any commissioner of the Assembly. And this happens relatively often. And so in the nominating committee report, which I think is Thursday morning at 11 a.m., I think, I need to check that. But everyone who's been nominated from the floor will be placed in opposition to a nominating committee nominee, and there will be an actual election on the floor with the famous clickers. And actually it's 9:30 a.m. Excuse me, 9:30 a.m. on Thursday, and it's a simple majority vote. There is no debate. There's no discussion. There's no saying this guy's the greatest man in the face of the earth or anything like that. It's just simply the names. So all the information that commissioners will have are in their bios in the supplement to the handbook. Obviously, we don't have that now because nominations from the floor don't open until the assembly opens.
Yeah,
So that will come out usually Wednesday evening, very early Thursday morning. And then men will need to look at the biographical information and make a determination as to who they will vote for. So I always encourage men to, number one, be on the floor during this report. And two, read the biographical information because these are really significant. These matters don't seem as exciting as overtures, but they're actually more foundational to the running of the church.
Absolutely, because personnel is policy, right? The people setting the hiring, the firing, these are the people that choose who will be our coordinators and presidents of agencies. For the most part, obviously those decisions have to be ratified by a committee of commissioner and then the General Assembly. But it's really hard to undo the work of a permanent committee, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, I was excited to see some of the names in the nominating committee report. T. David Gordon, Rick Hutton, your colleague there, Matt, Steve Tipton. You may be elevated to the Standing Judicial Commission if the nominating committee gets its way. But I was really disappointed that they didn't seem to want to return some key people to their positions. I noted our own moderator, Steve Dowling, was not the nominating committee candidate for SJC. Do y'all think he'll run as a floor nominee?
I would be very surprised if he didn't.
I hope so. I mean, and he gets to give our opening sermon or exhortation. So I'm very hopeful to see Steve Dowling's name as a floor nominee for SJC. I was surprised to see Zach Groff was not nominated for Mission to North America. He's been really active this year, really trying to help fill that general fund deficit, but he was not. Should we look for some other strong floor nominees? Have y'all heard any names of folks who want to serve the church?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard any, particular names. I think it's, always good and healthy to have those opportunities with options and good men putting their names forward. A lot of times I think it kind of comes down to who's more well known, right? I mean, Joe Smith might be the greatest guy in the world and the perfect fit for, particular agency, but if nobody knows who Joe Smith is, then it's harder to get that guy on. But I'm sure there will be plenty this year.
Yeah.
Sorry, Steve, I didn't mean to interrupt you. The way it seems to work in my limited experience is, if one of the floor nominees is very well known, sort of, famous, then probably doesn't matter that he didn't get the nominating committee nomination, right? Everybody knows it. But in the case where you have two men, neither of whom are well known, and it's, Bill and Jim, then it seems like generally the nominating committee nominee prevails in that case because most of the commissioners don't know either of the guys. They'll probably just sort of default to whoever got the nominating committee nomination. But when it's someone who's more well known, that dynamic seems to shift entirely.
Mm-hmm. So sometimes people will look at the presbytery too. That a guy from Presbytery, Mississippi Valley, or Westminster, or Savannah River Presbytery, versus somebody from a Metro Presbytery. Sometimes people look at that. What's the demographic makeup of that?
Houston Metro, the worst.
Houston Metro is the best of the Metro Presbyteries, though, I think.
Also where they went to seminary, too.
Yes. Thank you, Stephen. Yes. Yeah. So even if you don't recognize a name, you can look at his bio, as our Modfather was saying. Where does this guy come from? Who are his people, right?
Well, Ryan, I'll just throw this out there, but I might have been known to go back and look at prior General Assembly minutes at the list of people who asked to have their negative votes recorded to get a sense for where people stand on various issues. So
yes, and just because you record your negative vote doesn't mean that you're a terrible person. I remember standing behind David Strain to record my negative vote on I think it was the RPR matter was it Greensboro, where Calvary Presbytery forbade a man to teach his wrong views, his differences with the theology of the PCA. I think so. Maybe everybody here has signed a negative vote, but what you're negatively voting against or what you're protesting is often very significant. Whether it's
and then Ryan,
temperate fonts.
there's some of us on the SJC that have every one of our votes recorded in the minutes in the report.
Yes.
Yes. So there's ways to get to know people even if you don't know them. Let's transition to some overtures. Let's see. All right. So we've had more overtures this year than we ever had since 2014. So in the last 11 years, this is the highest number, and it may still go higher. Why do you think we have so many overtures this year?
I think, Ryan, you'll notice the very high bar on 2016. And I think the 2016 number was exaggerated. We had something like 20 duplicate overtures on the same matter from different presbyteries. That partly explains what we have here. There are a couple of issues where there are duplicates. So, for example, the call to form a study committee on Christian nationalism and its various isms. I think there's 4 or 5 of those now. There are at least 3 related to elevating a censure, one of which I'm the author of. So sometimes what happens is there are duplicates or closely related matters that will accelerate it. I also think a lot of times you'll have overtures that will be amendments to the book with regard to procedure. And usually the usual suspects are myself and Howie Donahoe, Ruling Elder Donahoe. So I've authored 5 this year, so I'm part of the problem. And I ghost authored 2. So, and Howie's written at least 2, I think maybe 3. So that's another reason why we have many.
Well, the big question is, do you think this year's moderator will be able to beat the record set by Ruling Elder Dowling last year for the earliest adjournment? What do we think? What's the over-under on the adjournment time?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a big piece of that is, what comes out of the Overtures Committee, right? I mean, so if you have a lot of really overwhelming votes one way or the other, I think you're less likely to get the floor debate. If you have some close votes, those are much, much more likely for someone to pull them out and want to talk about them, and then you end up in a long discussion. That's even before you think about minority reports.
Yeah.
So I think the difference, though, this year, and maybe I'm just being optimistic, but there are a handful, and I'm sure we'll be talking about them. I don't see the super controversial ones like we've had in years past. I mean, there are a few, but I don't think there are as many. And particularly if overtures can finagle a way not to get a minority report.
Right.
Minority reports take an enormous amount of time. The regular debate will take much less on the floor. So we can get good, strong overtures committee with pretty solid recommendations. Then there's a good chance that overtures portion isn't going to be as long.
That's right.
I will say, you look at where we end up spending a lot of time. It's usually overtures and RPR. Mm-hmm. Sometimes nominating committee, if you get, we were saying you get a lot of floor noms, it just takes a while to go through them all. Particularly if you have like 4 guys nominated for the same slot, that takes a little longer. But I do think between those two, preview for RPR, I think it's going to be another contentious year on a few issues. And then I think, overtures, if a handful of these rise to that level where we end up with some minority reports, Steve Dowling's record is going to get broken it's going to stand. We'll put it that way. So.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Ryan. He's right, because minority reports are what take the most time. That it's baked into the rules how much time everyone has, even apart from debate. And so I want stated for the record here that my year there were more minority reports than in Steve's year. So that allowed Steve to break my record.
And I think someone called the question a couple of times during your year, which may have helped that earlier
there's
turnout.
a usual suspect there. Yeah. So if we don't have minority reports, that makes the difference. And really that makes it hard to say, whether you have 30 or 40 or 50 overtures really doesn't matter that much. It's the minority reports, because I'm old enough to remember where we debated every single recommendation of the Overtures Committee. In about the last 5 or 6, 8 years, we have taken a larger number of recommendations in omnibus, which, wipes a dozen out in 30 seconds.
Right.
And we never used to do that. Now we do. So it's really just dependent on the number of minority reports. I don't know how many controversies we'll end up having, but I think Steve's right that I think Steve's record will stand at least another year.
Well, the other thing too, though, also when Overtures recommends to answer something in the negative, it's almost not even worth debating on the floor.
Right.
Because all it's going to do is give it back to, even if the substitute prevails, it just goes back to next year's Overtures Committee, and anybody could just submit a new overture from their presbytery. So, unless it's principle, there really isn't a whole lot of reason to argue to overturn a negative vote or a negative recommendation. So
that's an important reminder. And also an important reminder about the nominating committee, because it works the same with the permanent committee recommendations, unless there's a big hurdle for the committee of commissioners to get over that. So, very important to pay attention on who's being elected to these things. Well, if it's okay with y'all, let's talk about. There's 50 of them, but let's just try to focus on the government issues. This is Overture 8 regarding the recording of differences for ruling elders and deacons. This one seems controversial, but should it be?
Well, I guess my question would be, is there evidence of the controversial nature of this? It seems obvious. And in fact, I think if you go back and you look at the discussion of good faith subscription, whether you read it, gladly or with tears, it seemed that, at least in the discussion, that this was always the intention, that it wasn't just teaching elders, so to speak, who were going to be required to provide their stated differences, but rather that presbyters, elders in general would. And you could discuss how important it might be for deacons. That's maybe a separate question, but certainly with respect to ruling elders, the church that I served at for a long time in Pennsylvania, we, even if it wasn't required, every candidate for office had to provide their list of stated differences, and they were judged as if this were already in the book. So.
Pastor Stephen Warhurst, in Westminster Presbytery, y'all have adopted some very clear guidelines, as I understand it, for how a teaching elder comes into presbytery. What impact do you think that this would have on the piece of the church to have ruling elders, even if we just set the question of deacons aside, ruling elders listing any stated difference that he might have?
I think it's a great idea to have them list their exceptions to the confession. I'm all for it. I don't know in what sense it's controversial. They can still be received with those exceptions, but I'd like to know what the exceptions of the various ruling elders are in the churches. I think that's important to know, and it will trickle up. So I think that's important. I don't know about the effect of the peace of the church. I don't see why it would disturb the peace, but there are some cranky Calvinists out there that might have trouble, but generally
maybe
here and there.
And of course, the questions of what are the fundamentals of these doctrinal standards and what it means to, in good faith, sincerely receive and adopt are not well defined. But that's part of what it is to be PCA, that the session can define that with the review of the Presbyterian. The Presbyterian can define that with review of General Assembly.
Ryan, if I could just say one more quick thing on this one. When you do go back and you look at the origins of good faith subscription, whether we like it or not, the basic idea behind it was, and the reason why it's even called good faith subscription, is that a man, prior to the adoption of these changes to the BCO, a man who, in his own conscience, did not believe some portion of the confession was biblical, he had no mechanism to clear his conscience. He had to take a vow to affirm that he received and adopted the confession of faith. And so, in theory, or rather in reality, I would say, good faith subscription was a way for a man who's going to take that vow to take the vow in good faith, because the presbytery had already heard his differences and had judged that they were not in conflict with the system. And I would just go back to ruling elders and teaching elders take the exact same vow with regard to the confession of faith. It makes no sense to say teaching elders are the only ones who need to be able to make that vow with a clear conscience. It should be the case that anybody who makes that vow should have the opportunity, as long as we're going to have this in our system, to declare their stated differences and have them judged not hostile. Just it makes no sense not to do it.
I think too, Ryan, this is a good example of people reading and preparing for assembly. So, as many of you will know, I each year put out a document with my thoughts and recommendations about the various overtures. So do other men, teaching elder David Coffin and ruling elder Howie Donahoe. And I haven't finished my document yet, but when I send it out, Howie has pointed out that there might be an issue because nowhere does the book require sessions to record in their minutes these stated differences. So I think, having thought about that, I'll probably end up offering an amendment in the Overtures Committee to require that, to require sessions to record it and to handle this, to give a mechanism. There already is a mechanism for teaching elders in our language of our RAO about the review of presbytery records. So, thinking through these things, just because we've got these overtures doesn't mean that they're perfect and they won't be changed or amended and edited. It's actually very rare for an overture to come to the committee and then go to the floor with no changes.
I did have a question about this one because I wondered, maybe I'm just suspicious, I wondered if that first paragraph was an attempt to add good faith subscription to the individual church level. I guess technically it only applies right now to the presbytery level. Adding that first paragraph, would that mean that individual churches could not require a strict subscription or a full subscription from the ruling elders? And right now, do they have the freedom to do that? Could a church say, well, at our church, you're going to have to subscribe without exception? And adding that top paragraph, that first paragraph, would that change that? And now they would have to allow good faith subscription. Just a thought question. What do y'all think?
Well, I'll go on the record and say I love good faith subscription. I see it as a full subscription. That when a man brings his differences, he's bringing them in good faith. That
Right.
These are the only areas in which he believes the PCA is wrong, and so then the court gets to determine. Well, you think the church is wrong here, here, and here. Okay, that you think the testament is set forth frequently as a testament rather than a covenant. Okay, we don't think that's all that different, but I don't know that the presbytery can then require a session, even with this new language, to admit a man to church office if the session determines these differences strike at the vitals. Or but I'm the least intelligent person on this program.
Maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, it would certainly open you up to potential complaint. Similarly, I think you have that even in presbyteries where a teaching elder, maybe his exception is not allowed or denied or whatever. He doesn't have standing to complain, but one of the ruling elders, maybe in the church that was trying to call him, could easily complain against that action. So it's subject to the review and control of the higher courts, but it seems. I don't know. I don't want to say less likely, but I mean, in the instance you're talking about, Ryan, a church that finds an exception or stated difference to strike at the vitals, the judgment of that lower court seems like should stand as you go higher. But
And
I couldn't tell you what the presbyteries or the SJC would eventually do on this.
that's a clear area in which deference would need to be shown to the lower court, I would think. But I mean that, and even if the Constitution doesn't require it, the session, we can go narrower than our Constitution. We just can't go broader, right?
Well, and I'll say that, I mean, until I read this overture, it hadn't occurred to me this wasn't already required. It's certainly always been the practice at the churches I've been in that's what you did. I think Steve's point is an interesting one. I don't know of a church that presently requires strict subscription of its ruling elders, but I could see how you could make the argument that this opens the door to good faith subscription where it maybe didn't already exist. That strikes me as maybe not a tremendous threat, but what it will do, particularly with the amendment Fred was talking about, is it will subject judgments on the differences of ruling elders and deacons to review and control. Whereas presently, there's no requirement that they be recorded in the minutes. Essentially, that's the end of it unless someone files a complaint, right? We see in RPR every year issues that get flagged as exceptions of substance where a presbytery has judged a difference allowable and RPR disagrees. And so you could easily imagine a hypothetical where presbyteries start looking behind the judgments of sessions on what stated difference are allowable, and those in turn could be escalated further. So that's just something to think about, right? That you may find presbytery review of session minutes making judgments about whether differences are allowable, and that's something that we haven't had previously.
And Ryan, clearly there are differences that are not acceptable. Currently, as Mr. Fender has said, that only comes up through complaint. We actually have an instance of that in what's styled case 90-0, Bowen versus Eastern Carolina, which is kind of the foundational case that says that a man cannot disagree with the standards on either infant baptism or limited atonement. Now, that doesn't mean those are the only fundamental doctrines. It just means those are the only two that have been litigated, and the General Assembly has said that a man may not reject infant baptism and be an ordained elder. A man may not reject limited atonement and be an ordained elder. I would assume you couldn't reject, for example, total depravity and or any of the so-called 5 points of Calvinism and be an elder. But this would take it out of the realm of ecclesiastical litigation and make it review and control. I think, Ryan, you could make an argument that is for the better, because rather than making these matters be determined through judicial process or complaint, they would be just a part of ordinary review and control. And there would be less animosity and less opposition, and wouldn't be an adversarial relationship. It would just be more of a defining relationship.
That's helpful.
Fred, I think that's interesting, but it certainly opens the door. Like, I think you're talking, the case you cited was an SJC case, but it seems to me that through review and control, we might easily see a 40-5 on something like this, right? Because often RPR is writing back and forth with a presbytery saying, hey, we don't think the stated difference was allowable. The presbytery writes back and say, yeah, well, we think it was, right? And so you can easily see how it could jump to the next step under the right circumstances.
Right. But I agree with you, but 40-5 is a little bit different than 43 in that it's two courts speaking. There's not individuals involved.
Fair.
And so one might say it's more principial than adversarial on a given point. Although I know there can be procedures that go with it. It's more ordinary than extraordinary. I guess I might put it that way.
Fair.
Well, the debate. No, go ahead. I'm sorry, Stephen.
I'm more sympathetic with the second paragraph, that I like the idea of elders and churches making clear their exceptions, and then you see the judgment of the session on that exception. But I'm uncomfortable with that first paragraph. I'm just not sure if we want to add that or if it's necessary to add it, especially if it could be interpreted to mean it's taking the power of the session to say we're going to require full subscription from them by adding this here. That's what I'm a little concerned about. Just a thought. Well, you think we could do the second paragraph and not the first? Is the first one really necessary?
Is the first one just copied and pasted from 24?
I think so.
I believe
So-
so. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
So, and I think I get this from old Palmer Robertson, but I don't really see a difference between full subscription and good faith subscription. I think those are the same thing, but I could be wrong there. And before anybody points it out, let's move on to Overture 9. This, I think, is the most important overture of the year. This is our grassroots overture. It would not change the makeup of the administrative committee, but would change the franchise of some of the administrative committee members. Presently, the administrative committee somewhat functions like an executive board containing members who are elected from the General Assembly to serve on the administrative committee, and then 9 members who are elected from the other committees to serve as voting representatives on the administrative committee, for a total of 20 members of the admin committee. And I believe this overture comes from James River, and there just so happens to be an elder from James River here. I don't know if he wants to speak to this at all.
I would certainly be happy to. I might have had something to do with the drafting of this overture. So my view of Overture 9, let me first start by saying I don't want anybody to interpret this overture as casting aspersions on any of the work done by any of the staff of any of the permanent committees and agencies. We're thankful for the faithful labors of those who were doing that work. This is an overture that is about governance and trying to have good governance and good accountability. Because after all, our highest court of the church is the General Assembly, not the permanent committees and agencies. Those permanent committee agencies are, creatures of the General Assembly. They work for the General Assembly. And I think in our Constitution, we have a desire that they will be accountable to and governed by the General Assembly. And so my intent, my thought in putting these ideas together was, how can we make a very modest adjustment to our Constitution and to our RIO to make the administrative committee better reflect the will of the General Assembly, based on the men who've gathered year by year. And I mean, maybe everybody doesn't know. I didn't until I started digging into it, that the administrative committee consists of 20 members. 11 of those are elected at large by the General Assembly through the process that Fred so aptly described to us earlier, with nominating committee and floor nominations. But the other 9 are appointed, one each, by the permanent committees and agencies. So just right off the bat, 45% of the votes in the room at an administrative committee meeting are men who were appointed rather than directly elected. And when you consider that there's, inherently going to be kind of an insider nature of those folks who've been appointed by the other permanent committees and agencies, I have to imagine it's a fairly daunting thing to have just been elected by the General Assembly, show up at your first administrative committee meeting, and you're sort of surrounded by all these insiders. And so we're not proposing to exclude anybody from the meeting, but rather just to limit the votes to the directly elected members. And the idea being that would provide a greater degree of sensitivity in terms of the actions of the AC to the will of the General Assembly. I hope I said that right.
That all sounds very reasonable to me, but some people don't think I'm reasonable.
Well, if I could I think one of the discussions about this that I've seen is, on the one hand, the importance of the administrative committee in passing, or at least making, recommendations on budgets. And on the one hand, I'm not exactly sure when that started or how that came about, in the sense that the administrative committee is elected by the assembly because they have particular knowledge, gifts, and skills with regard to budgets and finance. But even if you were going to make that argument, then it goes back to what Matt just said. Why are they only 55% of the vote if that's the case? The other thing is that if these men are sort of, quote unquote, disenfranchised at the administrative committee meeting, that, for instance, the representative from Covenant College, or let me go the other way, Covenant College would not have anybody there to vote on their particular budget. But the problem with that argument is that Covenant College gets 5% of the vote currently on their own budget, right? They're not in any position to make any kind of actual change, to the makeup of the committee and what they're going to vote on their own particular budget one way or the other. So I think that argument falls flat. And I do understand that all of these men, all 9 of those men, are elected by the assembly, right? So it's not the case that these are, I understand what Matt was saying in the sense that they're appointed by their committees. They were elected to their committees, but they were not elected to be members of the administrative committee. And so if we feel like the administrative committee needs more members to do their work, that's a really easy fix. You increase the number of commissioners appointed to the administrative committee. We don't need to augment them with these other agencies. And by giving them the privilege of the floor, they're there to make the recommendations, to represent their various committees, and not move in the sense of Robert's rules, but present their arguments, etc. So I don't see a negative to this. I don't see the drawback to making this change. It seems both logical, but it also seems consistent with the way in which we man our committees, generally speaking. So I think it's a good plan.
Ryan,
go ahead.
I think there's 2 things about this. So first, I think, I've seen in the report and in the handbook out of the administrative committee that one of the arguments is that you need these members, appointed members, to foster collegiality. And I think what's one of the things that's important to realize is the current structure was not the original structure when the PCA was formed in 1973. The current structure came about because there was a need to get all of the committees and agencies together in a room to have one kind of unified purpose of mission, because they were in disparate offices in different states, and there was competition amongst them, and there was a thought of a need to create an avenue for collegiality. Well, we've done this one better in forming what's now the Cooperative Ministries Committee. That overture was drafted by my friend David Coffin several years ago, and I've chaired that committee now twice. And that is a very helpful committee where all of the committees and agencies get together and basically spend half a day talking about what they're doing and how they can work together. There are certain things like MTW and Mission in North America need to work together to do church planting in places like Haiti or Puerto Rico, because it's sort of Mission to the World, but it's sort of Mission to North America. So we need that, but we've already got that. So we don't have that there. The other thing is that, and I suppose there might possibly be a teaching elder from a certain former republic that is now a state in the state of in the United States that might offer an amendment. I'm not sure why, as Steve said, we're routing these budgets through the administrative committee. I think the committees and agencies would be better served by having direct access to the assembly, and submitting their budgets directly through their committees of commissioners. So that, I'm not sure why the administrative committee should tell Mission to the World how to spend its money. Because Mission to the World raises its own money. All of our givings are askings, not per capita. So there's nothing mandatory. The administrative committee is not charged with the burden of raising money for Mission North America or Mission to the World or the PCA Foundation. So I don't see why they would be saying, we think you should have less employees, or you should do more of this or more of that. I think it's just a mechanism right now to get it to the floor. And I'm not sure why we shouldn't send those directly through the committees of commissioners. It might lengthen the assembly by a grand total of about 4 minutes. And I think that would be an improvement rather than, giving Covenant College or Covenant Seminary a 5% vote on their own budget. Mm-hmm. I'd like them to have 100% vote on their own budget, right, and send it through the Committee of Commissioners for approval by the Assembly.
Well, Mr. Modfather, I think that would actually shorten the Assembly, because it seems like about half of the committee reports, there's do we need to pull recommendation 17 out? Then the guy steps back, he talks to the state clerk, he talks to the parliament. Oh yeah, we need to pull 17 out. Okay, we're going to pull that one out. And then the rest in omnibus. So I think it would save time to have these people voting, these agencies voting on their own budgets.
Well, and if I could add just a little bit to what Fred just said, I mean, so far we've been talking about budgets, but let's not be confused. Those 9 members are not just there at the administrative committee to discuss budgets. They have a vote on every item that comes before the administrative committee.
Right.
So,
Which includes even who the exhibitors are in the exhibitor hall. It's a very important.
yeah, I mean, every recommendation that you see in the AC's report, Covenant College gets, 1 vote in everything that the AC does. So, and not picking on Covenant College, they all get a vote. But my point is that it's not just when it comes time to budget, these guys come in the room and discuss these matters. They are members of the administrative committee. So,
Yes.
All right. Well, let's move on to let's see. Overture 10 deals with assistant pastors and a 5-year vote. I like the thought behind it. I don't know that Overtures is going to have the bandwidth to fix it to the point where it stands more than a snowball's chance in Miami or where's that one from? Orlando, a snowball's chance in Orlando of making it to see passage, but it's fostered a conversation. Overture 12, though, who may distribute the Lord's Supper? It seems pretty basic to me that this is a function of the session. What do y'all think? Is this one controversial?
like, I suppose how you answer that question probably has some indication of where you stand on the matter. I don't find it controversial. I've never served in a church. I've only served in 2 churches, but I don't even know that I've ever been in a church visiting where anyone but elders distribute the Lord's Supper. So,
So I have.
well,
I'm trying to think about how
you travel more widely than I do, Matt.
No, well, my wife and I were part of a church plant 25 years ago. That the church has made it and is still around in Metro New York Presbytery, where it's common that the teaching elders administer the Lord's Supper, but members of the congregation, men and women, are sort of scheduled to sort of stand up front and hold the plates while people come up and pick up the elements. And I think they still do it that way. I'm not sure. I've also been in churches where the elders are up front and the folks come up and get it from the elders, and they're the more traditional way of passing the plates. The practice at the church where I currently serve is that we pass the plates down the aisles, but if there aren't enough elders present, we'll have a deacon fill in, and if there aren't enough deacons, then we could go to any male member. That rarely happens, but that's our sort of session adopted policy. And so I think the question I would have here is this a theological question? Do we think there's some scriptural bar to non-members helping distribute the elements, not instituting the sacrament itself, but passing out the plates? Or is it more of kind of an imaging messaging thing? Like, we don't want to confuse categories, and therefore we think we're teaching something by having the non-officer distribute the plate. I can be convinced.
Yeah.
I think Ryan, excuse me. I think this intimates kind of what I do and how I think. I don't think this is controversial. As I've read this, I haven't settled, but I might offer an amendment to change officers to other ordained men. And the reason I would do that is one of the things we do in our practice is that, as Matt said, if we don't have enough current session members, we will use men who are ordained, not even officers in our church, but who have been ordained PCA ruling elders in another church, and they're in our denomination. They're ordained men. Mm-hmm. And both ruling and teaching elders. I have several retired teaching elders and teaching elders without call and a teaching elder missionary in my congregation, and we will use them to distribute. So most people might not care about that kind of language, but I care what's in the book and make sure that it's clear. And one of the questions that I've received is, what happens if that's the case? I think the intention of the author, who I know, was to allow that, but I would maybe give some clarity there. But other than that, I don't really. The only other thing that I don't think this prohibits is, obviously, I don't think the intention of this overture is to stop the kind of historical officers take the plates and then they're passed down the pews. I don't think this would require a ruling elder to jump over people down the pew to make sure no one else touches the plate. I don't think that's the intention, and it needs to be read that way. I've seen some arguments against it that actually use that.
Right.
I just think that's not common sense.
Well, in a situation
but
where
I guess it does ask the question of, whether you're talking about rules as intended or rules as written. As written, does it prohibit the passing of plates down the aisle? If I'm sitting in the middle, my wife is the one who hands the plate to me. Is this in violation of the change that's being made? And I get what you're saying, Fred. I did not read that as the intention, but if that's what it says, then we need to make some sort of an amendment, or you guys do at Overtures and try to figure out what's the better way.
We may, because I expect that argument to be made, and if we need clarity, clarity is good. I think people need to realize that our Book of Church Order is not just about a bunch of rules that we follow. It is our description of general biblical principles that the Word gives made more specific. And a very unheralded aspect of our Book of Church Order, I've been studying the Book of Church Order a long time, and I teach it at various seminaries, is to let our people know what our principles are. Any member of the PCA can go on the internet and click down and get this and read exactly what we think about church discipline or the formation of churches or the ordination of men. And I think giving some clarity on these positions is not gotcha moments, but it's saying to the people of the PCA at large, this is how we view the Lord's Supper. I think that's valuable.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to Overture 18 now. This is another grassroots overture requiring the RUF manual to be available. I didn't realize it had been this long since we'd approved an RUF manual. I know these manuals exist. I remember a very poignant moment at the St. Louis Assembly where there was something coming up from Evangel Presbytery to be put in the operations manual of MTW about people in line authority need to be ordained, and teaching at our coffin rose and reminded the assembly that the assembly sets the policy for our agencies, and this seems to be very much in line with that. The assembly needs to approve the campus ministry manual. What have you all heard about this one?
Yeah, well, this came out of my presbytery.
So they can blame you.
No, if I remember correctly, it came up from a session. I think there was some conversation with our own RUF committee about some of these things, but I think it comes back to just kind of what you see there before us, that at least in my understanding, this committee, RUF, has policies regarding these aspects, right? Recruiting, assessing, hiring, promoting, etc. Starting new works, closing works, all of those different types of things. And so the question becomes, if a permanent committee is making policy, at what point is there a level of review and control of those policies by the assembly? Certainly you don't necessarily, maybe some of us might like this, but we're not, I don't think it's asking for this to be put in the share file for everyone individually to read, but that as our committees of commissioners serve as the assembly's opportunity to interact with and to review the work of those committees, that they should have access to those things and be able to read them and make comments. Certainly it's certainly possible that there might be something in an RUF or any permanent committee's operating manual that would be contrary to our standards, contrary to all sorts of things. I don't think that's a controversial statement, because every year at RPR, we spend an enormous amount of time, even on the floor of the assembly, discussing actions or inactions of various presbyteries that were contrary to our Constitution. So, we're not saying they're bad people. We're just saying they're human, sinful people like the rest of us. And it's entirely possible that there are things in there that ought not to be there. And the only way to figure that out is to have those documents to be able to review. It's the same reason we require presbyteries to deliver their standing rules to the Review of Presbytery Records Committee so that they can look at those things and ensure that the rules of those presbyteries are in conformity with our subordinate standards. So this seems like a no-brainer. Again, and if someone's going to protest greatly, I wonder if perhaps they might protest a little too much, because this seems to be logical to me. So.
The logic certainly flows that if the RUF committee works for the General Assembly should be able to review its policy mandate. The standing rules of the presbytery that I serve, every committee is required to have a policy manual, and that policy manual is required to be approved by the presbytery. It just seems, as you say, logical. All right. Well, having resolved that, we have a pair of overtures. One from Pacific Northwest Presbytery that sets a minimum voting age for communicant members. I think it's safe to say I'm not a fan of this one. Maybe one of you can help me understand how someone could discern the body rightly at the Lord's table, but not be able to discern the body rightly at a congregational meeting.
Well, Ryan, this came up last year as well, and I think it has some grave constitutional conflicts. But first and foremost, I think it violates Preliminary Principle 6. I mean, this is you're creating a situation where you have communicant members of the church who vowed to be subject to the government and discipline of the church, but who are being disenfranchised from being able to elect the officers who will rule over them. And I just see that as a really serious problem. So to me, that sort of settles it. But there was an SJC case, I think, that previously some churches had this practice, and the SJC ruled that it was unconstitutional, and so this is an effort to amend BCO to make it allowable again. But I, like you, am certainly not in favor of it.
So, Ryan, this may be the first occasion in which I put in my document my position on this is unsure. Because I still haven't fully formulated this in my mind. The SJC decision that Matt refers to, I helped write, because I think clearly the Constitution as written does not allow a church to, in its bylaws, restrict voting by any communing member. And that's, I think, the genesis of this overture.
Right.
The difficulty about this is several fold. So on the one hand, you have the point that Matt makes well about being able to elect those who rule over you. This actually, it touches on the previous overture 10, about assistant pastors, and that you can have someone that people in the congregation call pastor, but they don't vote on, and doesn't really rule over them. It's not exactly analogous, but it shows the complexities of this. And then there's a further complexity that, for example, a congregation has to vote in a congregational meeting to dispose of property, for example. But according to most states' corporate law, a communing member cannot vote in the corporate meeting, which is also required in order to dispose of property. So it's pretty confusing. Yeah. I can say one thing, that as I've thought about this and listened to another podcast this week, I do think at a bare minimum, this needs to be changed to put a minimum age of 18.
Yeah.
I don't think we should allow a congregation to make 75 the age or 50 the age. And I don't think that's the intention here at all. But according to the book, you could do that. As a congregation, you could make 70 the age in which you disenfranchise everyone.
And the presbytery would have to give deference in a situation like that.
That's correct. So I think that needs some clarity at a bare minimum.
Yeah.
But I think you raise a good point, though, Fred, because in one sense, if we're going to say we're going to have a minimum voting age, and in order to have a member in regular and good standing who can vote, first of all, civil regulations aside, there is an arbitrariness to that, right? There are 18-year-olds that I would not allow to babysit my shoes, and there are 12-year-olds that if they had a driver's license, I would let them drive my car. I mean, maybe that's a little bit crazy. My point is there are very responsible 17-year-olds and there are incredibly irresponsible 19-year-olds. So to create just sort of an arbitrary age on the bottom, but then you have the other side too, right? I mean, why not a maximum age, in the sense of someone is incompetent, or why not just, one person at a time, where the court could make that decision, or would feel the need to make that decision. To me, this feels like, as some people say, I mean, this is a solution in search of a problem.
Mm.
I don't see, considering the limited amount of voting that congregations actually do, right? They elect their officers, and they dispose of property, and obviously there are the voluntary nature of being members of the PCA in general. There's not that many times for the congregation to vote anyway, and so to change the historic practice, at least of the PCA, to disenfranchise communing members under the age of 18, what is the significant issue and problem that we're trying to fix here? And for me, that's the question that I just haven't seen answered in the discussion. I don't know what podcast you were referring to, but didn't listen to it, obviously. That's the piece I don't get. Like, what problem are we trying to fix with this?
Yeah.
Pastor Warhurst, I wonder, as you interview a man or a child for membership, is that something that your session would take into consideration? Well, yes, we've heard a good profession of faith for a 4-year-old, but we really don't think that this profession is mature enough, because in addition to discerning the body, you have to discern the body. How does this, in a church with a lot of children, how do you take that into consideration?
Yeah, I thought this was an interesting overture. I think the problem they're trying to address is you can have a credible profession of faith, I believe, from a 7-year-old who knows he's a sinner. He is trusting in Christ. He's understands the elements of the sacrament and what they mean, and credible childlike profession, which Jesus said we're all supposed to have, a childlike faith. But they really have a childlike faith, and so we say it as a credible profession of faith. But they may not be discerning enough to understand what's going on in a congregational meeting when you're calling a pastor, electing ruling elders, dealing with property issues. And so I think you could have a credible profession of faith and should be welcome to the Lord's Supper, but may not be wise enough to participate and vote at the congregational level. That's what I think they're dealing with. I also have 8 children, so I had a lot of influence at the vote if I wanted to exercise that. I've got me, wife, 8 kids. There's 10 votes in the Warhurst family when they were all communing members. So that may be something else. What should we think about that? Then there's also the possibility of the children undermining the votes of their parents. So the kids don't like the guy because they like somebody else, and 2 parents vote one way, and then you got 3 kids vote the other way. I don't know. I think it's an interesting thing, because used to be head of household vote in the church, which I don't know if that's going to fly right now.
It seems like that would fix this issue, though, wouldn't it?
It would fix the issue. Just the question, we had a debate about this in Presbytery once. Should we have head of household votes? So might as well get controversial here, right? Make this podcast more interesting. And I remember one of the teaching elders said, I think that might be biblically right, but who's going to tell the women? That's a conversation we're probably not ready for in the PCA, but I think it's trying to deal with that issue of little kids with suffrage who we wouldn't let them vote. We won't let them drive either. We won't let them do lots of things. So I don't know. It's an interesting overture.
Ian, this is, I don't know if I'm preempting you here, but this is part of the reason why I wrote Overture 33, which my presbytery on a close vote declined to send forward because they basically thought, we're already doing this. We don't need to do this. Partly because I wanted it to be in the book explaining to sessions and to members what an examination of a young person looks like. Partly also, I think it dovetails with this Overture 22, because I don't think a requirement to be admitted to the table includes understanding how to dispose of property. And so you'll notice that that's not listed here in 57.2. I think, but on the other hand, to be admitted to the table is not just trusting by faith in Christ, because I think the Bible says you can be saved and not have an understanding of the body, not be able to, as Paul says, discern the body and not be admitted to the table. And so that's why I wrote this here. And I didn't just pull this out of, thin air. I took advice from about a dozen close friends, and some had much more language to put in than I put in here. I tried to have the truncated version. So I do think that's part of my indecision about Overture 22, because I think you're not fundamentally changing the nature of membership by restricting some votes. But I do think, for some of the points that Stephen just mentioned, but I think it's something that's going to require some significant discussion at the assembly.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, like I agree with almost everything that's being said, right? I mean, you have a 7-year-old who makes a great profession of faith, and property might be a slightly different issue given corporate bylaws and et cetera, but certainly we're talking about, officers. But I still come back to, this seems like we're making this arbitrary decision that, once you reach a particular age, 18 or whatever the congregation sets, that the maturity of that 7-year-old automatically, magically, whatever, transfers from can't vote in an election of officers to can vote. And maturity, just like 57.2, even the changes you want to make, this is a case-by-case basis, right? A session could say to a 7-year-old, we find your profession of faith to be credible. They could say to a 37-year-old, we don't find your profession of faith to be credible. It's not based on the age of the individual. Their admission to membership into the table is based upon their individual personal testimony, and then obviously the way in which they live their life and how the session views them. And so to me, the vote in the congregational meeting to draw that to an age, which is no measure of maturity, rather than to, you go from an individual, you're admitted to the table, but now an age, you're allowed to vote. Obviously, you still have to be a communing member to vote. That to me just seems arbitrary and strange. And if we want to say that we want to make sure that those members, communing members who are voting on officers, have a level of maturity, then why don't we figure out a way to do that rather than just allow a congregation to draw a line at an age? But those are just my thoughts, and I won't pretend that I've actually deeply thought about this. So just some concerns I have.
Well, I think this would be a helpful addition to guide a session to know what to ask, because I think some sessions don't know what to ask. Oh, okay, you're trusting in Jesus. Well, you're in, but not understanding that they need to understand the Lord's Supper, it's admission of persons to sealing ordinances to the supper. That's actually what you're doing.
Right. I think it's helpful. We do all those things, especially the understanding of the questions. Go over the questions in detail with the child. Make sure they understand every part of it and what it means and what they're doing, the vows they're making before God. And so I think that's a helpful addition.
Yeah. Well, we're going to start going long. So let's, unless anybody wants to discuss Overture 28 about M&A and or 34, let's move on to Overture 1. Is that all right? This deals with 32.2 and whether I was initially very much in favor of this, but as I've gotten older, and I haven't gotten that much older, but this Overture has been out for a long time. It seems like it conflates 31.2 and 32.2 and condenses them into one. That even if I bring charges against someone, if I have charges, specifications, everything is in order with an indictment, and I bring that to Presbytery on August 11th, Presbytery can then say, no, we're going to investigate. Well, I guess they couldn't do it this August 11th, but if this passes next August Presbytery meeting, they could do that. Or maybe I don't understand it. Where am I
Yeah.
wrong?
No, I think you're right, Ryan. I'm very much opposed to this overture. I've said in multiple occasions in multiple publications that BCO 31-2 investigations and 32-2 charges are parallel, not consecutive. And if someone brings charges, the court has to adjudicate it. The check against frivolous charges is that if someone brings charges that are frivolous or lighthearted or unwarranted, they can be censured as a slander of the brethren. So I think that's a sufficient protection. This change would allow courts never to adjudicate charges that someone brings under a Matthew 18. And I think further, it creates an additional problem at the presbytery level, because if someone brings a 32-2 charge against a teaching elder, and under this new language, the presbytery instead conducts a 31-2 investigation, and the investigation finds no reasonable expectation of offense, the original charger has no ability to bring about review and control or accountability. Any complaint that they would file would be found out of order for lack of standing. And I know this is the case because I think what is the genesis of this overture is an argument that I made at the SJC that proved persuasive when a presbytery took 32-2 charges and tried to turn them into a 31-2 investigation, which found no strong presumption of guilt, and then denied a complaint on standing. I said, this is fundamentally not fair. And the SJC agreed, and we sent it back to the presbytery to adjudicate. So I think I understand some of the impetus of this, but I am very much opposed to this new language.
My understanding, maybe you can correct me on this, because it says the process against an offender shall not be commenced unless some person or persons undertake to make out a charge. If we eliminate that, do we eliminate the need of having a charge before we take process? If that's eliminated?
Well, that's certainly one of the problems with it, is it seems to take away this, the opportunity for an individual to lay charges. As Fred says, an alternative method instead of arising through 31-2. The other problem, there's a massive conflict here with 31-9. 31-9 is the provision that says every voluntary prosecutor shall be previously warned that if he failed to show probable cause of the charges, he may himself be censured to slander of the brethren. Fred referred to it a few minutes ago. You'll note that the standard there under 31-9 is probable cause. Probable cause is a much lower standard than strong presumption of guilt. So if you write this into the book without changing 31-9, you've got a conflict as to what's the threshold standard for a case to proceed. And I think that's just not something we should do. I think you've ultimately an individual who wants to lay a charge. If we're going to have biblical conflict resolution, if we're going to avoid running to civil courts, there's got to be a way for someone who insists upon bringing a charge to do so. Right? The courts of the church have to be open, and I think this would be.
Well, but it also, I think it. And Stephen, you brought up one of the things that I was concerned about. You have this language of make out a charge in 32-2. You also find it in one sense in 31-2 that a strong presumption of guilt shall proceed to a charge. But there is a logic to the connection between chapter 31 and chapter 32. This utterly guts that connection and has 31-3 through the rest of the chapter almost as an appendage, and then you come to 32-2, which is basically now describing what a 31-2 investigation ought to look like, but it's not in 31-2, it's in 32-2. And so even just the ability of the average person to pick this up and to try to figure out how to conduct a trial, how do you make out a charge? There's that language is just completely removed now from the BCO. The only way a charge would ever arise, and I think the point is that this is not made clear. You have to understand this by inference. The only way a charge can ever come forward now is through a 31-2 investigation that would look like 32-2, whereas 31-2 has very little specific information to it.
Yeah, and I think, Ryan, I want to connect what Steve has said with what Matt has said. And that is, if you read this, the language of a charge is gone. And so what you essentially have is someone brings an allegation, which then is sent to the court under what essentially would be, I would assume 31-2, although there's no reference, because new language 32-2E says there's a strong presumption of guilt. And I would say even further, Matt said that it would be a change in the burden. I think it changes it entirely, because under 31-2, there is no such thing as a voluntary prosecutor. I think it does away completely with a voluntary prosecutor, because as you read 31-2, it says that the prosecutor shall, mandatory language, shall be a member of the court, except that in the case before the session, he may be any communing member of the same congregation. So what you're doing is you're doing away completely. If I'm a member of a PCA church and a member of another PCA church punches me, and I bring a charge or an allegation under this new language to his session, they will investigate it. And even if they find a strong presumption of guilt, I can't prosecute that case. I'd have to find someone in that accused church to prosecute it. Because under 31-2, there's no such thing as a voluntary prosecutor. I think this is a very problematic overture.
I think it would be helpful to insert a lot of this in 31-2, because a lot of courts, and part of the problem is with 31-2, where it comes from, the presbytery was understood not to have any investigative powers. But now that our courts and our history have had presbyteries doing a lot of investigation, this will be helpful for them to know the things that they should do. But we still need to know when process commences, and there has to be a way for a voluntary prosecutor to bring those charges, actual charges, not allegations, but charges.
Well, but I could also go back earlier in the BCO and say that the necessity to determine whether an offense is personal or general is already required. And if it's personal, to determine whether Matthew 18 has been followed is already required. To ask the question, does the nature of the alleged offense rise to a level warranting judicial process? It's already required. Is the accuser like any of those described in 31-8? It's already required. And so to list all these things here, to say these things have to happen before process commences, if that's all they're intending to say, that's fine. But then you get to E, and again, E changes the nature of how the court takes up a case. If you want to say the court has discretion over whether or not it takes up charges, just say that, right? If you want to say, like even as Fred was saying, I mean, I think it should be something along the lines of, if I go to Fred's presbytery and I want to be a voluntary prosecutor against Fred for punching me in the face, and the presbytery refuses to take those up, I think there ought to be some constitutional remedy to say I have limited standing to complain against that action because I raised it and they refuse it, or something along those lines. But this doesn't fix the problem. Again, I think we're back to a solution in desperate search for some sort of problem, and I don't think it's there.
Now, Ryan, I want to say something here for the record. I would never punch Steve in the face because I am much too smart to take it up with a Marine. There's no chance of that happening.
All right. Well, I see there's Overture 31 from Houston Methodist Presbytery. I think this is another obvious fix. The situation I have in view, you've got a 6-man commission elected on a 55% vote of presbytery to bring somebody into process. And then 55% of the presbytery elects 100% of that commission. That commission doesn't like the guy who's under process, and so they vote unanimously to suspend him administratively while he's under process. He's in big trouble. So I really appreciate the Modfather's presbytery requiring a 2/3 vote of the entire presbytery in order to suspend a person's official functions while he's under process. I assume this vote was about unanimous, Mr. Moderator.
It was pretty close to that. It might have even been.
Yeah.
Well, if I could, there's two things that I would love for the Overtures Committee to take up as they look at this. One of them is the commensurate section about appeals, that if a man appeals, it automatically suspends his censure unless by a majority vote of the court, or maybe it's 2/3 vote. I'm not sure.
I think it's 2/3.
But whether or not that ought to be handled by the commission that remains in place until the appeal is completed, or whether that also needs to be taken up by a commission. And I think that would be germane because it's talking about the same item or the same basic issue. But the other one is, I've seen this happen in a number of cases where a man is suspended at the court's discretion. And I'm an avid reader of SJC minutes, I guess, getting ready for potential service on the SJC. And occasionally you'll see someone appeal to the SJC to say, well, no, my suspension was not or was by way of censure. And unfortunately, the SJC has only the minutes of the case before them. And they say, well, no, the court voted to suspend you, but not by way of censure. And therefore, on its face, it can't be by way of censure because the presbytery said it wasn't by way of censure. So what I would love to see, that if you're going to suspend a man, particularly a teaching elder, but I think it goes with ruling elders as well. If you're going to suspend a man from the fulfillment of his duties, from his office, I think you need to put in your minutes your reason why you're doing that. And that, in a way, it becomes more reviewable by the higher court, that you are stating the reason why you're doing this. And we require no reason currently. And that means that you could do it for any good reason or no good reason or no reason at all. So I think that would be a helpful addition, Fred, and whoever else is on Overtures this year.
And I'd like to see an escrow account included as well, that if you're going to suspend a man, if you're going to take his pay away, then and he's exonerated, the presbytery or the session, well, I guess most ruling elders aren't paid, but I know like All Saints in Richmond has a paid ruling elder on staff. So then you need to make that up to him. If he's exonerated, I think that would cut down the number of administrative suspensions drastically if somebody's got to provide back pay, which could be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But maybe I'm too worldly minded. I should probably repent.
Well, that creates sort of an interesting, it raises sort of an interesting question that whenever you're dealing with a discipline case, yes, you have a session that wants to get rid of teaching elder. Yes, the presbytery has to, vote to dissolve the call. But if the session decides to just stop paying the guy, what's the presbytery really going to do about it?
Yeah.
There's, at the end of the day, the power of the purse strings is if the session wants to defy the presbytery, that's just a practical thing that there's really not much you can do because we have this grassroots polity. I also know that when we reviewed this on CCB, this overture, it raised in my mind something I hadn't really considered before, that the use of a BCO 15 commission essentially allows you to end run any supermajority requirement.
Right. We
We have lots of them written in the BCO. For example, you need a 2/3 vote to presbytery to elect someone to overtures for more than 2 years in a row. Well, any of those supermajority requirements can be in run by creating a commission and empowering the commission to do the thing. And so this is an attempt to fix that in one instance. But
maybe there needs to be a fix to BCO 15.1 to fix all of those in one spot.
something to think about.
Yeah. Well, that's the end of about most of the overtures that I wanted to talk about with y'all. Is anybody have any other favorites that I missed? Any moderator predictions? I hear there may be a former RCA minister coming for nomination, which I think will be a unifying Dutchman who taught us all about the elder who reintroduced us to our doctrine of concupiscence. I've heard Kevin DeYoung as mentioned. Anybody else that we're anticipating to be nominated?
I haven't heard any others.
Right. Well, brothers, thank you so much for your time. We've got a lot of government overtures to get through. I appreciate your sharing your expertise and your concerns and your enthusiasm.
Thank you for having
Thanks
us.
for having us. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for joining the conversation on the Westminster Standard Podcast. You were hearing from the Modfather himself, Teaching Elder Fred Greco, Teaching Elder Stephen Warhurst, Teaching Elder Steve Tipton, and Ruling Elder Matt Fender as we discussed the overtures related to the government of the PCA. Join us again next week as I'm joined by another all-star panel to talk about the process overtures as we try to divide up the different sorts of overtures. We'll also discuss the proposals for various study committees. So that'll be out next week, God willing. Now, please remember to visit the Metanoia Prison Ministries website if you are interested in going on that tour of Walker State Prison, just a little bit away from the Chattanooga General Assembly. That's Tuesday of General Assembly week at Walker State Prison. You can visit Metanoia Prison Ministries website to sign up. You can email Shelby Howell, sghowell@pcanet.org. There are only about 25 spots available, so if you are wanting to do that, now's the time to sign up. Well, join us again next week for a discussion of the process overtures and the proposals for study committees. I'll talk to you then.